The torrential rain felt like icy needles as the heavy oak doors of the Brooks estate slammed shut. Penniless, abandoned in the storm, and shivering in a ruined dress, Josephine thought her life was over until a motorcade of armored Maybachs flying diplomatic flags tore through the darkness to claim her. The tires of Harrison's Range Rover crunched agonizingly slowly over the imported white gravel of the Brooks family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. To Josephine, known as Josie, to the few people who actually cared about her, the sound was like the ticking of an executioner's clock. "She's just protective Josie," Harrison said, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "My mother has a certain standard, but she'll love you. Just let me do the talking." Josie smoothed the skirt of her navy blue dress. It was a modest piece she had saved up for months to buy from a boutique in Manhattan, but against the sprawling backdrop of the Brooks mansion, a monolithic limestone fortress that looked like it had been airdropped from the French countryside, it suddenly felt incredibly cheap. Harrison Brooks was the heir to Brooks and Montgomery International, a logistics empire that effectively owned half the shipping ports on the eastern seaboard. Josie, on the other hand, was a junior archivist at the New York Public Library. Her background was a blank slate. She had been left at a Catholic orphanage in St. Gallen, Switzerland, as an infant, carrying nothing but a heavy gold signet ring engraved with a faded crest. Adopted at age 4 by a kind but impoverished American couple who had since passed away, Josie was used to fighting for everything she had. But fighting Victoria Brooks was an entirely different kind of war. The front doors were opened not by Harrison, but by a stern-faced butler, who wordlessly ushered them into a foyer dripping in baccarat crystal and marble. Waiting for them in the formal drawing room was Victoria. She stood by a roaring fireplace, nursing a glass of vintage Bordeaux. She was a striking woman in her late 50s, wearing a severe emerald silk blouse and a staggering diamond tennis necklace that caught the firelight. "Mother," Harrison said, his voice instantly dropping an octave in an attempt to sound authoritative. "This is Josephine." Victoria did not extend her hand. Instead, her pale blue eyes raked over Josie from the top of her damp hair down to her sensible black pumps. The silence stretched until it became suffocating. "Josephine." Victoria finally purred the name, sounding like an insult on her tongue. "Harrison has told me absolutely nothing about you, which in my experience usually means there is something to hide." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Brooks," Josie said, keeping her voice steady despite the flutter of panic in her chest. "Harrison speaks very highly of you. Does he—" Victoria took a slow sip of her wine. "How quaint. Please sit. Dinner will be served shortly. I prefer we get to know each other without the staff hovering." They moved to a massive mahogany dining table. The storm outside was beginning to brew fat drops of rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. As the first course, a delicate lobster bisque, was served, Victoria began her interrogation. It was not a conversation. It was a deposition. "Harrison mentions you work in a library." Victoria began her knife delicately buttering a roll. "A noble, if entirely unprofitable, pursuit. Tell me, what do your parents do?" Josie felt Harrison stiffen beside her. He hadn't told his mother she was an orphan. "My adoptive parents passed away when I was in college, Mrs. Brooks. My father was a high school teacher and my mother was a nurse." Victoria's perfectly arched eyebrows shot up. "Adopted, I see. And your biological family—" "I don't know them. I was left at an orphanage in Switzerland." Victoria slowly placed her butter knife down. The clink echoed sharply in the cavernous room. "An unclaimed child from an international orphanage," she repeated, tasting the words as if they were sour milk. "How incredibly cinematic. Harrison, did you know this?" "Mother, please, it doesn't matter," Harrison mumbled, staring intensely at his bisque. "It matters entirely. Harrison." Victoria snapped her polite veneer, cracking. "Bloodlines matter. Legacy matters. You are the heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire. You do not marry a stray dog simply because it followed you home." "Mrs. Brooks?" Josie gasped, the sheer cruelty of the statement knocking the wind out of her. Oh, don't feign outrage, my dear. Victoria sneered, reaching under the table and pulling out a thick manila folder. She tossed it onto the center of the mahogany table. The seal on the front read, Cromwell and Hayes, one of the most ruthless private intelligence firms in New York. Do you think I would let my son bring a woman into this house without doing my due diligence? The thunder outside cracked a violent boom that rattled the crystal wine glasses. Inside, the atmosphere was equally explosive. I hired Cromwell and Hayes to dig into your little Swiss origin story. Victoria said, leaning forward, her eyes gleaming with malice. And do you know what they found? Absolutely nothing. Your adoption records in Geneva are sealed under a level 4 diplomatic lock. Do you know what kind of people have their records sealed like that? Josephine criminals? International fugitives, the illegitimate offspring of disgraced politicians. Josie's heart hammered against her ribs. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a normal person. You are a parasite, Victoria shouted, slamming her hand on the table. You saw an opportunity in my weak-willed son, and you thought you could infiltrate this family. You thought you could secure a piece of the Brooks fortune with your pathetic sob story. Josie turned to Harrison, desperately searching his face for support. Harrison, say something. Tell her that's not true. Harrison looked between his mother's furious face and Josie's pleading eyes. He swallowed hard. The silence stretched agonizing and absolute. When he finally spoke, his voice was a pathetic whisper. Josie, maybe you should go, just for tonight, until she calms down. The betrayal felt like a physical blow. The man who had whispered promises of forever into her ear just hours ago was now abandoning her at the first sign of friction. Not just for tonight. Victoria commanded, her voice dropping back to its icy, aristocratic drawl. Forever. Griggs. A massive man in a tailored black suit stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. He was the head of the estate's private security. Escort this woman off my property, Victoria ordered, waving her hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. And ensure she leaves the grounds entirely. I don't want her loitering on the driveway. Mrs. Brooks, there is a hurricane warning outside. Josie said, panic finally bleeding into her voice. I don't have my car. I took the train up here with Harrison. There are no taxis running in this weather. Then you had better start walking, Victoria replied, picking up her wine glass once more. Griggs, now. The security guard clamped a heavy, unrelenting hand onto Josie's arm, hauling her out of her chair. She didn't fight back. The shock and the absolute humiliation paralyzed her. Harrison didn't even look up from his plate as Griggs marched her through the foyer, out the massive oak doors, and shoved her onto the front steps. The door slammed shut, locking with a heavy final click. The storm was biblical. Sheets of freezing rain lashed against Josie's face, instantly soaking through her thin dress. The wind howled through the ancient oak trees lining the mile-long driveway, violently whipping her hair around her face. She had no umbrella, no coat, and her phone showed a stark no service in the upper right corner. Tears of sheer frustration and heartbreak mingled with the rain as she began the long, humiliating trek down the winding gravel path. Her sensible heels sank into the mud, twisting her ankles with every step. Her mind raced with a toxic mixture of grief and anger. Victoria's cruel words echoed in her head. Stray dog, parasite, nobody. She reached the massive wrought iron gates at the entrance of the estate. The automated sensors detected her, and the gates slowly swung open, expelling her onto the pitch-black deserted stretch of rural Connecticut road. Shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached, Josie huddled under the meager shelter of a massive elm tree. The world was dark, freezing, and entirely devoid of hope. She closed her eyes, clutching her arms around herself, wishing she could just disappear. Then the ground began to vibrate. It started as a low, rhythmic thrumming beneath the soles of her ruined shoes. Josie opened her eyes. At the far end of the dark road, a pair of incredibly bright LED headlights pierced the torrential rain. Then another pair, and another, A massive motorcade was speeding down the wet asphalt, moving with terrifying precision and speed. 6 armored Mercedes Maybach S680s, entirely blacked out, roared toward the Brooks estate. Above the howling wind, Josie heard the distinct heavy chopping sound of a low-flying helicopter hovering just out of sight, its spotlight cutting through the clouds. The motorcade didn't drive past her. It slammed on its brakes, the tires hissing against the wet road, forming a perfect defensive semicircle around where Josie stood shivering in the mud. Josie froze, terrified. Had Victoria called the local police to arrest her for trespassing? The doors of the lead and trailing vehicles burst open simultaneously. A dozen men and women wearing sleek, water-resistant tactical suits and earpieces poured out, fanning out into the storm with military efficiency. They didn't look at Josie. They faced outward, securing the perimeter. Then the rear door of the center Maybach, a vehicle bearing diplomatic plates and a small gold-fringed flag on its hood, opened. A tall, distinguished man with silver hair stepped out. He was dressed in an immaculate 3-piece Savile Row suit that defied the torrential downpour. He carried a massive, heavy-duty black umbrella, which he immediately opened and held over Josie, shielding her from the punishing rain. Josie stared at him, bewildered and terrified. Who are you?" She stammered, her voice shaking from the cold. The man looked at her, his eyes tracing the contours of her face, before dropping to the gold signet ring she wore on her right hand, the only thing she had from the orphanage. His stern face suddenly broke into an expression of profound, almost painful relief. He didn't answer her question immediately. Instead, this impeccably dressed gentleman stepped back into the freezing rain, allowing the umbrella to rest entirely over Josie, and dropped to one knee right there in the Connecticut mud. "Forgive the dramatic intrusion. Your Serene Highness." The man said, his voice carrying a crisp, undeniable European authority that easily cut through the roar of the storm. "My name is Chancellor Sebastian Dupont, Chief of the Royal Household of Valois, Bavaria. We have been searching for you for 22 years. It is time to come home." Josie stared at the impeccably dressed man kneeling in the freezing mud, the torrential Connecticut rain hammering aggressively against the heavy-duty black umbrella he held over her trembling frame. The words, "Your Serene Highness," hung suspended in the icy air, a phrase so overwhelmingly bizarre and foreign that it felt vastly more jarring than the violent thunder echoing across the dark rural landscape. For a long moment, the only sound was the furious wind tearing through the ancient elm trees and the rhythmic, aggressive idling of the 6 massive armored Mercedes Maybachs surrounding her. "You have the wrong person," Josie finally managed to stammer. Her voice was barely a raspy, broken whisper against the howling vortex of the hurricane. She clutched her arms tightly across her chest, feeling the icy rainwater dripping down her spine. "My name is Josephine. I work at a public library in Manhattan. I take the subway. I buy my clothes on clearance. I am nobody." Sebastian Dupont rose slowly and gracefully, his bespoke Savile Row suit seemingly indifferent to the brutal deluge pouring from the midnight sky. He reached up, tapped a sleek communication earpiece resting discreetly in his left ear, and signaled with 2 leather-gloved fingers. Instantly, the rear door of the flagship Maybach swung open, and a highly trained female operative stepped out into the tempest, quickly draping a heavy beautifully heated cashmere tactical cloak over Josie's shivering, soaked shoulders. The sudden enveloping warmth was so absolute it made Josie's knees buckle, but Sebastian gently caught her arm to steady her. "You are Josephine," Sebastian said softly, his steely, intelligent gray gaze resting entirely on the faded gold signet ring, gripping her right index finger. "But you are absolutely not a nobody. That ring you have worn your entire life, the ring your adoptive parents could never quite manage to remove from your hand, bears the ancient royal crest of the House of Valois, Bavaria. You were born Princess Josephine Adelaide, the sole legitimate heir and daughter to His Majesty King Frederick and Queen Mathilde." Josie's mind spun violently, completely unable to anchor itself to reality. 22 years ago. Sebastian continued raising his voice to cut clearly through the roaring storm. During the sovereign crisis of 2004, your parents were targeted by a radical, heavily militarized insurgency, bankrolled by a shadow syndicate aiming to destabilize the monarchy. To protect you, the Queen's most trusted lady-in-waiting smuggled you out of the royal palace in the dead of night. She carried you across 3 international borders, ultimately leaving you at the street, Gallon Catholic orphanage under the absolute highest diplomatic seal. We believed you were lost to us forever after that facility suffered a catastrophic targeted fire in 2008. The Crown mourned you. The nation mourned you. We did not know you had already been adopted by a kind American couple and relocated quietly to the United States. Josie gasped, pulling the heated cashmere cloak tightly against her neck. The sealed adoption records Victoria Brooks had so viciously mocked just 20 minutes ago in her crystal-draped dining room suddenly made terrifying absolute sense. "How did you find me?" Josie asked, her teeth still chattering, though whether from the cold or the sheer shock of the revelation she could not tell. "You applied for a standard passport renewal last week for a library archiving conference." Sebastian explained calmly, gesturing toward the open, inviting warmth of the armored vehicle. "Your fingerprints and facial biometrics were run through the international database. They instantly triggered a highly classified dormant alert at Interpol, a fail-safe hardwired directly to our Royal Intelligence grid in the capital. We mobilized the extraction fleet within the hour, crossing the Atlantic aboard a private supersonic jet. We have been tracking your cellular location since you boarded the train with Harrison Brooks. Now please, Your Highness, I implore you. We must get you out of this storm and into secure airspace." Numb with disbelief, Josie allowed herself to be guided into the cavernous rear cabin of the armored Maybach. The heavy door closed with a pressurized hiss, instantly cutting off the deafening roar of the hurricane. The interior smelled of rich cedar-fine leather and safety. The ambient lighting was a soft, calming amber. The operative immediately handed her a steaming porcelain cup of Earl Grey tea and a dry towel. Sebastian climbed into the plush leather seat opposite her, his umbrella already stowed away by a guard. He tapped a highly encrypted tablet mounted on the center console. "Pilot, confirm airspace clearance with the United States State Department. We will fly out of JFK International directly to the capital. Estimated time of departure is 40 minutes. Josie sat in silence, staring deeply into the swirling amber liquid of her teacup. Images flashed rapidly through her mind. The condescending sneer on Victoria Brooks's face, the devastating sound of the butler locking the massive oak doors behind her, the humiliating, agonizing walk down the gravel driveway in the freezing mud, and Harrison cowardly, pathetic Harrison staring blankly at his lobster bisque, while his mother threw the woman he supposedly loved out into a deadly storm like a piece of discarded garbage. "Wait," Josie commanded. Her voice surprised her. It was no longer the trembling, uncertain whisper of a frightened, abandoned orphan desperate for approval. A sudden white-hot clarity washed over her, hardening her spine and sharpening her vision. She looked out the thick, bulletproof window toward the distant, illuminated silhouette of the sprawling Brooks mansion, resting arrogantly on the hill. Victoria Brooks had called her a parasite, a stray dog trying to steal a fortune. "Achacha, change of plans. Chancellor Dupont." Josie said, her eyes narrowing as she meticulously set the delicate porcelain teacup down on the silver tray in front of her. "Before we proceed to the airport, we are going back up that driveway." Sebastian Dupont paused, looking at the young woman sitting across from him. He saw the iron will of the late King Frederick burning brilliantly in her dark eyes. A slow, deeply satisfied smile touched the corners of the seasoned chancellor's mouth. "As you wish, Your Serene Highness," Sebastian replied, tapping his earpiece once more. "Commander Dubois, turn the fleet around immediately. We are paying an unscheduled visit to the Brooks estate." Outside, the 6 massive Maybachs executed a flawless, highly aggressive, synchronized U-turn on the slick asphalt, their tires hissing loudly against the flooded road. The motorcade roared back toward the towering wrought iron gates of the Brooks property, entirely abandoning the concept of a quiet, diplomatic exit. Chancellor, the main estate gates have been locked and electronically secured, the lead driver reported over the secure intercom. Ram them, Sebastian ordered without missing a single beat. Josie braced herself instinctively, but the 10-ton heavily armored Maybach barely even shuddered as its reinforced steel tactical bumper smashed violently through the intricate wrought iron gates, tearing the heavy metal off its concrete hinges with a horrific screeching crash. The royal fleet surged menacingly up the imported white gravel driveway, tearing deep trenches into the immaculate million-dollar landscaping, and parked in a highly aggressive tactical wedge formation directly in front of the mansion's towering main entrance. "Shall I have the perimeter secured, Your Highness?" Sebastian asked quietly, calmly adjusting his silver cufflinks. "Secure the entire house," Josie replied, her voice dipping into absolute ice. "Nobody leaves this property." Heavily armed royal operatives poured out of the vehicles into the rain with terrifying military precision. The massive oak doors of the mansion, which had slammed so cruelly in Josie's face barely an hour ago, were forcefully kicked open by Commander Dubois, shattering the lock and sending wood splintering across the marble floor. Griggs, the towering head of estate security, who had physically dragged Josie out into the storm, rushed into the baccarat crystal foyer, his hand reaching aggressively for his holstered weapon. Before he could even draw a breath, 4 separate red laser sights painted his chest. He froze instantly, his eyes widening in pure terror, and raised his hand slowly into the air. Josie stepped out of the Maybach, the heavy, expensive cashmere cloak billowing dramatically behind her in the howling wind. Flanked closely by Sebastian Dupont and 6 heavily armed royal guards wearing tactical armor, she walked slowly back into the brilliantly lit foyer. She didn't bother wiping her ruined, muddy shoes. She deliberately and forcefully ground the wet Connecticut dirt deep into the priceless antique Persian rugs. Panicked voices echoed loudly from the formal dining room. Victoria Brooks stormed out into the hallway, her face twisted in aristocratic, unbridled rage, with a terrified Harrison trailing anxiously behind her. "Griggs, what in the absolute world is happening?" Victoria shrieked, but her voice died in her throat, her mouth dropping wide open in sheer disbelief. There, standing dominantly in the center of her immaculate, exclusive foyer, was the girl she had discarded like worthless trash just moments ago. But Josie was no longer trembling. She stood tall, radiating an undeniable, terrifying aura of power, surrounded by elite European operatives bearing submachine guns, while a distinguished foreign chancellor stood respectfully at attention, slightly behind her right shoulder. "Josephine." Harrison gasped, his eyes darting frantically between the heavily armed men, the laser sights, and the distinct diplomatic insignias sewn onto their tactical vests. "What is this? Are you completely out of your mind? Have you brought armed mercenaries into my mother's house?" Victoria quickly recovered a fraction of her haughty composure, though a thick blue vein throbbed visibly in her tense neck. "This is a gross, unforgivable violation of private property. I'm calling the governor immediately. You have exactly 10 seconds to vacate my estate before I have every single one of you arrested and federally charged with domestic terrorism." Sebastian Dupont stepped calmly forward, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor, completely unfazed by her screaming. From inside his tailored jacket, he produced a heavy leather folio bearing a magnificent gold crest and snapped it open with a flick of his wrist. "Victoria Brooks." Sebastian stated, his voice ringing through the cavernous foyer with cold, absolute, uncompromising authority. "I am Chancellor Sebastian Dupont of the sovereign state of Valois, Bavaria. The operatives you see standing before you are the elite royal guard operating legally on American soil with full diplomatic immunity granted directly by the President of the United States. And you, madam, have just committed a severe act of high treason against the crown by physically assaulting and deliberately abandoning the reigning heir to our throne in a life-threatening hurricane." Victoria let out a sharp, mocking laugh, but it sounded hollow, brittle, and underscored by rising terror. "The heir, don't be utterly ridiculous. She's a penniless orphaned librarian from Manhattan Cromwell, and Hayes ran a full background check. They confirmed she is an absolute nobody. Minor. Your private intelligence firm hit a level 4 international diplomatic firewall, Mrs. Brooks. Sebastian countered flawlessly, his gaze boring into her soul. A highly classified firewall designed specifically by the global intelligence community to protect Her Serene Highness, Princess Josephine Adelaide. The young woman you just boldly referred to as a parasite is the sole proprietor of a sovereign wealth fund currently estimated at 42 billion euros. Harrison's face drained of all remaining color. He looked at Josie as if he were staring at a terrifying ghost. Josie? You're a princess? Is this actually true? Josie finally stepped forward. The intimidating royal guards parted seamlessly, almost reverently, to let her pass. She looked directly at Victoria, whose arrogant sneer was rapidly melting into a devastating mask of pure, unadulterated horror as the reality of the situation crashed down upon her. You sat at your dinner table and told me that bloodlines matter, Mrs. Brooks. Josie said softly, her voice carrying perfectly in the quiet, utterly tense foyer. You told me that legacy matters, and that a stray dog has no place in a house of power. You were absolutely right. Victoria swallowed hard, her eyes darting frantically to the gold signet ring on Josie's hand, finally recognizing the historic centuries-old royal crest stamped heavily into the metal. Josephine, Your Highness, there has clearly been a terrible, tragic misunderstanding. I was testing you, to ensure you possess the fortitude to be worthy of Harrison and the Brooks Empire. Do not insult my intelligence. Josie replied, her tone dipping into absolute freezing ice, slicing through Victoria's pathetic lies. You showed me exactly who you are, both of you. She slowly turned her piercing gaze to Harrison, who actually flinched under her stare. You sat there, Harrison. You let her drag me out into a violent hurricane. You didn't even look up from your soup. You're a coward. Josie, please, you have to understand I was shocked I didn't know what to do. Harrison pleaded desperately, taking a pathetic, stumbling step forward. Two royal guards instantly leveled their automatic weapons directly at his chest, forcing him to freeze in terror. I love you. We can fix this. We can get married just like we planned. Mother apologized to her right now. It is far too late for pathetic apologies, Josie said, turning her attention back to the trembling matriarch. While I was sitting in the car, I asked the Chancellor for a brief economic summary of Brooks and Montgomery International. It seems your vast shipping logistics empire relies almost entirely on the exclusive, highly lucrative freight contracts you hold at the ports of Marseille, Genoa, and our sovereign deepwater harbor in Valois. Is that correct? Victoria's face went completely startlingly white. The color drained from her perfectly manicured fingertips all the way to her throat. She looked as though she was about to faint. Yes, she whispered the word barely escaping her lips. Chancellor Dupont. Josie said, not taking her eyes off Victoria for a single second. Cancel the Brooks shipping contracts, all of them. Immediately revoke their maritime access to our territories and blacklist their vessels from our allied European ports. Wait, no! Victoria shrieked, all of her pristine aristocratic poise vanishing in an instant, replaced by sheer primal panic. She practically threw herself forward, her hands raised in desperate supplication. You cannot do that. That is 60% of our global revenue. It will bankrupt the entire company by Monday morning. Our board of directors will strip us of our shares and leave us with absolutely nothing. You threw me into the mud. Victoria, Josie replied, completely and totally unmoved by the older woman's sudden hysterical tears. Now you get to see exactly what the bottom feels like. Josie, I beg of you, Harrison cried, actually dropping to his knees on the ruined, muddy Persian rug, tears streaming down his face. I am so sorry, I'll do anything. Please, I'm begging you, don't destroy my family. Josie looked down at the man she had thought she loved just hours prior. He looked so incredibly small, so entirely pathetic, weeping on the very floor he had just let his security guard drag her across. "You destroyed yourselves," Josie said simply, her voice devoid of any pity. She turned her back on them, the heavy cashmere cloak sweeping elegantly across the shattered marble. "Chancellor, we are leaving. We have a flight to catch." "Yes, Your Serene Highness." Sebastian bowed deeply. He signaled the operatives. They backed out of the mansion with flawless military precision, their weapons raised, never taking their eyes off the weeping Brooks family until they were safely out the door. Josie walked out the shattered front doors and climbed back into the waiting Maybach. The storm was still raging furiously outside, but inside the armored cabin it was warm, quiet, and completely secure. As the majestic fleet began to roll down the destroyed driveway, leaving the devastated Brooks estate behind in the darkness to face their utter financial ruin, Josie poured herself another cup of Earl Grey tea. She looked quietly at the heavy gold ring on her finger, feeling its weight not as a burden of the past, but as the undeniable crown of her future. She wasn't just Josie, the librarian, anymore. She was Princess Josephine Adelaide, and she was finally going home. Did you love this incredible story of betrayal, royalty, and ultimate revenge? The Brooks family learned the hard way that you should never judge a book by its cover, especially when that cover belongs to a billionaire princess. If this dramatic twist kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life revenge stories. Drop a comment below on what you would do today.